April 15th, 1986. Over the Gulf of Sidra, night air stretched thin and blue-black at 80,000 feet. Two men sit in tandem beneath a jagged canopy the color of moonless water, riding the knife edge where sky turns to space. Their world is gauges and green numerals and the throaty, unbroken roar of two J-58s drinking fire. A warning tone needles the intercom, crisp and insistent. The pilot watches it like you'd watch a lit match near dry grass. The reconnaissance systems officer keeps his voice level because that is the job. Spike. Long-range search. New strobes. Multiple. The screen paints a fan of hostile attention rising from the Libyan coast, cones of energy feeling for something that should not be here. And then the word no one likes to say, launch. They do what Blackbird crews were taught to do when the earth throws knives. They do not jink like fighters. They do not pull for the deck. They go up and go fast. Throttles ride their forward stops. The airplane answers like it's been insulted. Metal warms behind their shoulders. The nose lifts like a sentence being finished. Somewhere far below, a battery crew stands in headphones and watches a sharp seed rocket into the sky, then stage, then grow stupid with thin air and lost geometry. The missile is fast and mean and temporary. The airplane is patient and permanent and receding. Mach numbers tick over like a train leaving stations, 3.1, 3.2 to 3.3, and the warning tone goes from certainty to sulk and finally to silence. Later, when the cockpit is as cool as it ever gets, the pilot will say they reached a speed he'd rather not write down in the log. He will write it down anyway, because later men need numbers more than adjectives. He will remember the way the stars smeared a little on the canopy as the airplane ran away from trouble, the way some animals sprint for the tree line and disappear. He will remember that the standard evasive action, if you can call it that, is to climb and accelerate until physics runs out of ideas. He will remember that in night air over the Gulf, the rule held again: speed and height beat the rest. The story does not start in the Gulf. It starts with a different sea, a dry one made of alkali and rumor, fenced by mountains and secrecy, the Mojave of the early 60s, where a door marked with a skunk taught America to make impossible things out of titanium and stubbornness. The brief was written in ash and embarrassment. U-2S had climbed like polite sins over the Soviet Union and Cuba until the day a white spear found Francis Gary Powers and stitched him out of the sky before a world of cameras. Overflights of that kind were done, but presidents still wanted eyes, and satellites in those days blinked like tired watchmen. The answer had to be something that turned the whole attack problem into a timing problem. Go so high and so fast that the intercept mathematics couldn't quite resolve before the target had already become yesterday. The answer had to be a shape with no straight edges the radar could love, a skin that did not melt at temperatures that made aluminum weep. It had to breathe fuel the way camels drink water, reluctant to start, unstoppable once going. It had to be flown by men who were not brawlers, but auditors of risk, precise and contemptuous of blur. So the airplane we remember as SR-71 took life from a tangle of code names, a 12, Oxcart, Archangel, while men learned how to cut titanium with tools that didn't exist yet, and to seal tanks that leaked on the ramp until heat swelled everything shut upstairs. The first time it went from black line on paper to black streak in daylight, it looked like a dare someone had forgotten to take back. It would go on to set records that stand like survey markers nobody else has found a way to move. It would go on to never be caught in anger, not once, not by fighter or by missile, in a service life that ran across presidencies like a ridge of high desert. Pick a month in the long middle of the Cold War and place a line on a wall map from Biel to Kadena or from Mildenhall across the Norwegian Sea. That's where the rhythm of this story lives. In crews stepping to jets, hours before dawn, patching themselves into suits that made them strange to their own reflections, checking that the sled was ready, CAVU air, tanker brackets, the DEF suite warmed, cameras cold, and then gimbaling from blacktop to black sky in minutes that felt like cheating. The call signs were tidy and understated. The routes had names that kept their teeth behind their lips. Baltic Express, Giant Scale, Barents Box. The rules were as you'd expect from men who were not allowed to be surprised. Say little. Let the airplane speak. Believe the instruments. Don't prove your courage when you can prove your math. The men who chased them had different rules, written by doctrine and pride. On the Kola, on the Karelian Isthmus, in East Germany and around the arcs of Murmansk, pickets grew like aluminum forests. S-75 sights with their long white fingers, S-125 CS for low sky, S-200 batteries that could throw a dart from far enough away to make your faith in range tables wobble, and later, too late for most of the story, the first hex-shouldered Guardians that would be named S-300. They watched the edges of their screen for the thin, high scratches that meant the guest had arrived. Fighters in QRA sat with canopy glass fogged by breath, crews half-strapped. If the Blackbird obeyed the schedule they thought they'd learned, there would be a chance to climb and cut the corner and be in the right cube of sky at the right 10 seconds. Those were good shifts, full bellies of coffee, hands already writing the after-action. We were there. They were rarely there in time. The airplane stole time from men who needed it. The airplane's shape made the Earth treat it differently. The Chinese along the forward fuselage were born of radar equations and turned out to be aerodynamics with a sense of humor. They made lift where you didn't plan for lift and steadied the jet in the thin air where ordinary wings begin to forget their work. At speed, the J-58s stopped being ordinary engines and flirted with being ramjets, shock cones moving like the iris of a careful eye, inlets swallowing the world in controlled violence. The cockpit heated to desert noon while night walked in the windows. The fuel itself, JP-7, was a character in the story, hard to light, harder to vaporize, stubborn in ways that made men of the refueling boom operators and gentle tyrants of the fuel system techs. The simplest truths wore the best clothes. The faster you went, the safer you were. A missile's energy bleeds in thin air. A guidance computer loses its lock when the target is a streak and not a thing. A fighter that can get to 60,000 feet cannot stay there long enough to do more than wave. An entire defense architecture could aim, launch, and miss an airplane that had already forgotten the coast it left. Take a window of time that the men at Mildenhall remember. Winter light over the North Cape was the color of steel water. The route was a drawn bow across the Barents and then down along the Baltic seam, careful of neutral air and careful of nothing else. The jet left tanker tracks as contractual as signatures. The crews could set their watches by the first growl from the threat receiver as Murmansk woke up and took their measure. Up there, the world looked half-finished, the fjords like scars, the ports like toys, the lights of the Kola in winter like beads on wire. Below, attention plotted itself, high-power acquisition, then the thoughtful death of a main-beam search radar as ECM fed it lies, then a fighter or three trying to build a ladder into a sky that did not want them. The pilot flew numbers, Mach, true altitude, inlet temps. The RSO flew ideas, timelines, antenna lobes, what the ground was thinking, and whether it would get bored in time. Now and then, in the lonesome moments when the threat receiver fell quiet, the RSO would look at the camera system's frozen patience and think about the men in rooms who would look at its harvest and write language that would never mention his name. That, too, was the job. On one cold pass in that northern world, the plan went difficult, and then it went strange. A compressor hiccup became a full cough. The left side J-58 paid its taxes all at once, and the jet that was an arrow suddenly felt like a man with one leg. The Blackbird will fly on one engine, but it's a drunk walk when you have to do it with the enemy listening. The crew turned toward a coast that wasn't friendly and wouldn't be generous. In the turn, their trajectory brushed a neutral's fence and rang a neutral's bell. 4 aircraft rose from Swedish concrete with a choreography that anyone in that part of the world would recognize. The JA-37s came up clean and came up fast. And the lead, pragmatic, professional, placed his angles where he could be useful. He closed to escort a jet that did not ordinarily need friends. On a different day, the Swedes had practiced how to lock this visitor as an exercise of craft. This day they created a guardrail with wings. If anyone out of Kaliningrad or over the Gray Sea tried to be brave, they would have found a wedge of Nordic insistence between themselves and the crippled giant. Photographs were taken from cockpits, odd mementos of a small kindness in a large war. Decades later, files opened and the quiet courtesy earned ribbons in a room where the applause sounded like relief. Between such stories, between the missile that could not and the Swede that did, lived the routine that kept the airplane honest. Dawn briefs were short on adjectives, weather over the route, tankers committed, special instructions, caution on Soviet naval bastions, confirmation that certain radars had come back to life. The crews ate the way men eat before something that makes the hands shake. They walked to the jet like church, helmets in crooks of elbows. The ground crews walked around the machine as if being watched, and in a sense they were. The jet recorded the competence of every hand that touched it and rendered verdicts at Mach. Climb out was a set of pages that turned the same way every time. At 30,000, the airplane was fast. At 50, it had run out of company. At 70, it was a rumor. Over the ice or over the jungle or over the desert, the same old radar tones announced themselves like drunk uncles at a wedding. A Soviet S-200 search lobe felt different from a North Vietnamese S-75's arrogant song. You learned the difference and never forgot. The airplane's defensive suite worked like a gossip, telling lies about where the jet really was, flooding the enemy's ears with stories that could not all be true, daring the math to keep up. The system wasn't magic. It was just good manners in a bad neighborhood, and it bought the crew what they always needed most. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, enough seconds that the missile would find itself clutching air, where a moment ago there had been a hot idea. There is a number that shows up in hangar talk and in official sentences the way a knot shows in wood. It is big, and it has the roundness of a legend. You want to sand it down and make it neat, and you cannot. The number is 4,000, the rough tally of shots taken at the jet across theaters and years, in rage or in rehearsal or in the desperate need to save face against something that made your job look stupid. Definitions vary. Pilots and batteries count differently. States blur the line between practice and promise. But step back from the quibbling and the picture holds. In all those tries, no shot ever drew blood. None of the missiles learned to fly finally in air as thin as the Blackbird's home. None of the radars learned to speak a language the jet could not, at least for a moment, confuse. None of the pilots whose job was to be the last human problem a Blackbird ever faced arrived in the same cube of sky at the same instant with a weapon that could reach and hold. That isn't luck repeated 4,000 times. That is design and doctrine and discipline. The men on the other side were not fools. If you write this as if they were clumsy, you write a fairy tale nobody respects. The PVO, Soviet Air Defense, thought hard about the problem that wore this black paint. They built long arms in the form of S-200 batteries that could throw a spear high and far, and they tried to teach those arms to punch above their weight. They flew fighters trained to anticipate more than to react, men who learned the routes by calendar and the altitudes by gossip from listening stations. They practiced ground-controlled intercepts like chess players, drawing the board from memory. Now and then, in those winters when the light stayed low, a MiG-25 clawed up through air too thin to love it and found its screen full of a target for a few white seconds. Locks were made, shots were not taken, so far as the open record goes. The target ran, as it always did, on its circle of speed. The fighter fell away into thicker air that gave it back its breath. On at least one bad day for the Blackbird, the Soviets had more than geometry going for them. A crippled jet with one engine is something even a proud airplane wants to hide. But even then, distance and neutrality and the ordinary decency of Swedes conspired to deny the drama any fire. North of Hanoi in another decade, and at another altitude, you could draw a different picture and find the same ending. The North Vietnamese shot SA-2s like they were burning money. They fired in salvos at Blackbirds that roared in from the Gulf and walked inland like thunderstorms. The geography made their solutions tight, and their fuses hopeful. The airplane made their solutions late. There were close calls. There always are. A white spear passing a beam at a distance that your mother would not understand. A warhead that could have stitched aluminum into confetti if the timing had been luckier. But the jet left, every time, at a speed that made the landscape a smear. The crews went to the bar on Cadena or back to a small room at Beale and shook their hands out at the sink and said little. You don't preen when you outrun something the ground can afford to shoot again tomorrow. At Mildenhall, the camaraderie had a proper English varnish, crews walking to bikes on cold mornings, groundmen who had learned that this airplane would tattle if you got lazy, tanker crews with their own brand of gallows humor about what it means to put a shiny metal pole into the back of a dragon. At Cadena, the culture was older and more nicknamed. Locals called the jet Habu for the snake it resembled, sleek, black, venomous in aspect, if not in intent. And crews wore the name the way you wear a title earned in a distant campaign. The Japanese children along the fence lines learned to count the flames in the night. The bar stories, when men allowed themselves the sin of good talk, sounded like a liturgy, inlet unstarts, and how to catch them, how a little more rudder than you'd think could steady a yaw at Mach that would turn a lesser airplane into crumbs, how in the thin places between states the sky went purple and then almost black, how the earth looked like a globe under glass, indifferent and near. There were rules inside the cockpit that felt like superstition and were really statistics. The pilot's right hand treated the throttles like a stubborn animal, never jerk, always slide. The RSO watched the DEF panel with the vigilance of a father who has learned to hear a child breathe from across a room. The airplane would tell you when it was unhappy, through a yaw that warned of an inlet going sour, through a temperature that told you the air had given up being hospitable, through a flicker on the edge of a screen that hinted some ground radar had switched from search to murder. The fixes were rarely heroic. They were adjustments, patient and dull. A little quicker, a little higher. 10 degrees right to bring a lobe out of alignment. You didn't go to work to be brave, you went to work to be correct. One day the airplane was asked to prove a point in front of people who keep minutes. Across the Atlantic, reporters who forgot they weren't supposed to like the military stood in a glass palace waiting to see if the speed records were hype or honest. The jet made a day of it, New York to London, in a time that made history books nervous, back across the continent with a parsimony of fuel that would make an airline jealous, final arrival in a museum that would polish it for tourists. The crew climbed down with expressions that said what their words did not. It is not a stunt if the airplane can do it any Tuesday. The proof lived in the logs long before the press found out. And the airplane went on as before, flying the old routes past the old radars that kept trying to solve a problem they thought should be solvable. But this is not a record book story. It is a cat and mouse story, where the cat keeps bringing new claws and the mouse keeps getting smarter. On paper, the S-200 could do things that made the old SA-2 look like a crank toy. Its missile was long and fast, and its radar could see deep into the fading blue where the Blackbird lived. In practice, the S-200 shots had to thread needles, guidance that held at speed, fusing that didn't light the warhead too soon, control surfaces that could still bite air that thin. The Blackbird didn't need to be invulnerable. It needed only to be allergic to the kind of engagement the S-200 preferred. You can have a faster tip speed than your prey and still fail to make the geometry work. That is as true in hunting as it is in SAM doctrine. A missile launched from far away arrives honest but spent. A missile launched from closer arrives young but cannot climb into the place where the heat lives. The airplane stayed in that place. It played the border where math hurts. Sometimes the job asked the crew to do petty things in service of grand ones. Over North Korea, a decade and a half after the first U-2 embarrassed a nation, a Blackbird flew a pattern designed not to gather, but to bait. The point was to make the other side shoot and listen to what their radars sounded like when they were angry. The crew flew the route exactly, like a fencer holding a line with his blade tip, and the missiles did what missiles do when provoked. The crew climbed and accelerated and went away, again, until the tape of the other side's voice was full. Later, engineers turned those voices into fingerprints. The next time those radars woke up somewhere else, the analysts would know who they were at hello. This was work for quiet men with long memories. It was not the kind of war you boast about at home. It was the kind of war that the world prefers, one fought with information and friction and restraint. The airplane did not forgive sloppiness, lose rhythm in the inlet management, and you flirted with an unstart, an abrupt, violent hiccup that shoved the nose and rattled bones. Do it at the wrong time, and you might find yourself exploring parts of the envelope you only ever met in the sim. Fly into a tanker too fast, and you embarrassed two crews at once. Fly into one too slow, and you wrote a report about why the mission ended early. The suit itself, the pressure garment that made a man into a creature part astronaut, part diver, could ruin your night if you did not secure a seal or if you drank the wrong thing too late in the timeline. There were crews that came home dehydrated and exhausted and exalted, the way men do when the work is correct and the world stays boring. At Mildenhall some afternoons, a young captain could stand at the edge of the dispersal with earplugs in and watch the jet come home. The landing pattern was almost slow by comparison with what you knew the airplane had just done. The touchdown was firm and specific, and the tires, special, silvered, engineered for heat and habit, sang a private note. The jet looked impatient to get back to the one place it liked to be. Mechanics in green walked out to meet it, as formal as priests. The crew ladder came up and the pilot took off a helmet that made him anonymous and became a man again. If you watched him close, you might see that the world seemed heavy to him for a minute or two, as if gravity had joined him in the cockpit and refused to leave at the door. From time to time, the airplane had to remind Congress that it existed in 3 dimensions, not just in budget lines. It was expensive, yes. Everything about it cost, not only money but institutional pride and inter-service crosstalk. Satellites had their champions, drones had their future, the Blackbird had its record, and its stubborn refusal to die when a politician wanted it to. You cannot put Mach numbers on a PowerPoint slide and expect a committee to smell kerosene, but you can walk them to a museum and show them the thing itself. You can let them put a hand near the Chinese and feel, even without touching, that this is a machine built to leave people behind. Sometimes it was enough, sometimes it was not. The airplane retired, the airplane returned, the airplane retired again. In the space between those verbs, there were missions. The Earth did not pause its need. You can make this story about machines and doctrine, and you would be honest. Or you can bring it back to 2 men in a cockpit at night, the Gulf Coast lights under their left wing like a necklace, a RWR tone rising from an old enemy's instrument panel, and the pilot's right hand sliding forward like a blessing. That is the scale that matters when it matters. The ground says launch, the jet says no, the missiles arrive in a place that the airplane used to be. The crew does not cheer. They do not pound the dashboard like movie men. They listen for the next tone. It always comes. It always goes. The Baltic had its own theater. In the late 70s and early 80s, the route called Baltic Express was wired into the habits of East German tracking stations and Soviet fleet headquarters like a chime in the wall. Batteries on the peninsula watched the horizon line like men expecting a prowler at 2 a.m. The jet rose out of England, shook hands with fuel, and then walked the edge of international airspace like a lawyer reading a contract aloud. On one of those days, GCI screens in the east showed a contact that climbed like a promise. A trio of MiG-25s got orders that turned their world into a straight line. Climb, turn, climb more, there. For a sliver of time, their screens showed something that looked like victory, a target in range, a geometry not insane, a shot you could explain to your commander later with your shoulders square. And then the streak became a smear, and then the smear became a ghost, and then the ghost became nothing. It is not shame to be the second fastest thing in the story. It is simply biography. There were other close scrapes that ended without funerals because the airplane carried not only speed but friends. In the north, a tanker turned where it shouldn't and stayed because weather stole choices. In the south, an E-3 drew pictures for the crew when the DEF suite had a sulk. The Blackbird's legend can make you forget that it was part of a family. The reconnaissance wing, the tanker wings, the quiet men who listened, the techs who treated every fitting as if it were a confession. Legends are solo, programs are choirs. A young RSO once wrote in his personal notebook something he only ever admitted out loud years later. The thing that saves us is that they believe we are a legend. Men hesitate in the presence of myth. He meant that the other side's crews, SAM operators, fighter jocks, colonels with control of lines on maps, brought to their scopes and their headsets a story about the Blackbird that made their hands a fraction slower. When you believe a thing cannot be caught, you chase differently. You are more careful, and careful is the first cousin of late. If that is true, then the airplane's speed helped twice, once in the air and once in the mind of the men below. And still, strip the romance away and you return to the ledger that mattered. In operational history, no SR-71 fell to enemy action. Speed and altitude plus ECM turned intentions into anecdotes. On paper, the United States retired the airplane because it was expensive and because newer ways of seeing the Earth promised to be cheaper and safer and more continuous. In practice, the world kept producing problems that only a man in a fast jet could solve. Weather that mocked satellites, fleeting targets that moved between passes, adversaries who learned to read NOTAMS and plan their lies around predictable eyes. The SR-71 came back for a while and then went away for good, delivered into museums where children stand under its nose and look up like old astronomers. The operational log stays as a ledger of a bargain kept. Where it went, it saw. When it was shot at, it left. When it left, it lived to go again. There is a line you hear from pilots who flew it, and from crews who loved it, and from enemies who never quite knew it, but tried like hell to undo it. We never got a scratch from enemy fire. A dozen lost to test and to accident, none to war. It is not bragging if you say it softly. You say it softly because you remember the missiles that came close enough to taste, the warning tones that pinned your shoulders, the reports written by men who were good at what they did and simply ran out of sky that day. You say it softly because the world did not need another martyr with wings. It needed an airplane that made other people waste money and time and courage for nothing. A final night worth walking slowly. A crew departs Mildenhall under a sky the color of a pencil. Tanker on time. Climb like a rumor, the Barents below like hammered iron. The first radars wake the way old men wake, noisy and reluctant. An S-200's voice comes later, steadier, with the confidence of range. The RSO watches the trace and says nothing for 3 beats. The pilot moves his hand forward through an arc he has traced since he was assigned to this jet. The Mach builds as if summoned. The nose lifts a finger's width. The world becomes just a little thinner. Somewhere on the Kola, a commander says, "Fire," because he has to be seen to be a man who will fire. The missile runs uphill toward a vanishing point that keeps slipping away. At the point where it would need a miracle, the missile is nothing but good intentions and hot air. It has done everything right in a story that does not allow its kind of ending. The crew hears the threat system yawn and then close its mouth. The camera looks down and keeps its own counsel. The jet writes a long black line on a chart that no one will see outside a vault. They turn home on numbers that feel like habit and finish a day's work by showing up at the exact minute a table full of planners have written. There is nothing to applaud. There is only the click of a pen and the cheap coffee of a debrief. The Russians will write their own stories later about how they almost and nearly and sometimes did, and the West will write its own stories about how it never and not once and no way could. And the truth will be simply that an airplane built for a single kind of argument kept winning it for 30 years. If you cannot catch me, you cannot kill me. If you cannot kill me, you cannot stop me from seeing. Men on both sides grew old trying to beat those sentences. The airplane grew old too, but it never forgot its lines. Late winter, 1978. RAF Mildenhall, a wind that makes the ramp feel like old iron. 2 ground crew in parkas circle the jet like surgeons rehearsing the cut. Panels closed, Chinese gleaming like the edge of a straight razor, silvered tires chalked, safety pins counted out like rosary beads. The pilot studies a line item that never changes. First tanker bracket, time on track, DEF checks, and then the line item that changes every time, what the other side has to say about it. Mildenhall folk call this route by a name that sounds like a commuter's promise, the Baltic Express. Because it leaves and arrives as punctually as any train, and because its horizon is always the same, Kola ports glinting like pins, listening posts like teeth, the Baltic laid out like a map for someone who lives above maps. The orders are clean: hold international airspace, show the cameras what they came for, come home with speed and good manners. The only omen is the weather. The only prayer is the fuel. Gear comes up with a thud you feel in your teeth. The airplane's mood changes at 30,000 feet. At 50, it is itself. By 70, you are a rumor with a heartbeat. The reconnaissance systems officer watches the DEF scope for the first polite hello from the far side. It comes the way the sun comes, never suddenly, always predictably. An acquisition lobe swings like a lighthouse, the threat receiver hums a note you've heard since schoolhouse days, and then the ground grows braver and asks for a track. Men on the Karelian flats sit in vans warmed by bad heaters and decide whether today is the day they will prove a point. They teach their radars to speak a command voice. They teach their missiles to climb where the air is thin enough to turn wings into hopes. They launch because launching is their signature, and signatures matter to men who will have to face a colonel with a ruler later. A white spear leaves a field and becomes a line, and then becomes a geometry problem the airplane intends to grade. The pilots were taught to hear 3 letters in their sleep: R for search, M for track, L for launch, and to treat them like the stages of trouble. Today, as on most days, the letters cannot complete the story. At the first hint of certainty, the pilot adds half a thumb of throttle and a millimeter of pitch. The airplane answers like a good horse, ears forward, shoulders up. The tone on the threat panel goes from sermon to mutter, and somewhere below, a radar crew shakes their heads. The missile dies young, not because it was poorly made, but because it arrived where the airplane used to be. Years earlier, and a hemisphere away, the Taiwanese Straits had taught other aviators other manners. But it is North Vietnam skies that give this airplane its bad temper. The SR-71 comes to Kadena in 1968 with a snake's name stitched into its new myth, Habu, for a viper that locals respect from a distance, and the island learns to keep a clock by the sound of two J-58s going to work. The crews on the Rock become connoisseurs of humidity, fuel temperature, inlet behavior. The North Vietnamese become connoisseurs of disappointment. They shoot SA-2s like confetti at parades, hundreds across the years, and write reports with the bravery of men who cannot change physics. The Blackbird arrives, the Blackbird leaves. The warhead blossoms in a sky that is suddenly nobody's. The losses the airplane suffers in those years, an inlet that unstarts like a heart missing a beat, a fuel pump that errs, a bad day that turns into a worse glide. These are accidents, not enemy triumphs, and the record says so with the unemotional simplicity of a maintenance log. The airplane's shape is a set of decisions you can trace with your fingertips. Chinese that started as radar math and became lift like a magician's extra hand. Inlets that move like pupils. A fuselage that leaks cold fuel on the ramp because the skin only seals properly at heat, the way some men only tell the truth when they are mad. At speed, the engines stop being engines in the ordinary way and start acting like funnels for compressed air, a ramjet masquerade that only works if the cones think faster than your mistakes. The suit turns the pilot into a curated organism, neither astronaut nor aviator, a sealed and sipping creature inside a glassy cave. The cockpit is day-bright with work lights when the outside world is star-black and indifferent. You see the curvature of the planet because that is the price of the ticket. You do not write that in your log. You write EPRS, TITS, Mach, fuel remaining, and DEF chirped, ECM answered, no further. There is a night in April 1986 that every crewman can recite, as if he were there, even if he was not. The Libyan coast says its name in the threat receiver long before anyone on the ground can see the wake of a ship. Boys in Tripoli have been told the sky is theirs. Batteries inked on Soviet draftsmen's tables decades ago have been assembled in desert light by conscripts with coffee breath. Orders crackle. The Blackbird comes hunting for photographs the way a barrister hunts for precedent, not to make a fight, but to win the argument afterward. The battery commander on the coast does the inevitable. He fires the long-arm SA-5 his allies have given him, because not firing is harder to justify than failure. The missile obliges the laws of rocketry and then discovers the laws of thin air. In the cockpit, a number the crew will later not write down becomes the only sentence that matters. The jet runs away from trouble as if trouble were on a leash. The men in Tripoli write what men always write when faced with a geometry problem they cannot solve. We tried. We will try again. The SR-71 writes what it always writes. BDA obtained. No damage, the enemy adapts. They always do. In the north, the PVO layers its shields, S-75, S-125, S-200, each a different answer to a different question about altitude and approach and nerve. The S-200 is supposed to be the answer to the question this airplane asks, high and far and fast. And on paper the numbers look excellent. Range that lets a commander feel powerful. Speed that makes a chart seem brave. But paper does not have thin air on it, and computers in vans do not get younger at altitude. The missile will do Mach many. The guidance will struggle with a target that is a streak. The fuse will suffer the curse of premature certainty. A near-vertical shot climbs, exhales, dies. An oblique shot starts younger and arrives breathless. The men on the ground work hard. The men in the jet work harder at a discipline that is older and simpler. Do not be where the math concludes. Another winter, another geography. The Barents in January looks like steel left outdoors. The crew crosses tanker tracks that have names no one outside the unit will ever hear, and makes time on a point that is a cloud and a number. Somewhere beyond that point, a radar you've never met, raises its voice. The pilot adds 3 millimeters of throttle. The RSO watches a kind of firefly dance on a screen and remembers the schoolhouse where the instructors pretended their voices were quiet even when they were not. If you get R/M/L in that order, you do not argue with destiny. You make it keep up. The order comes. The airplane answers, the tone sulks, and then shuts up. Later, over scotch and an ashtray full of formaldehyde breath, a man will say, not proudly, simply, "We didn't do anything special. We just let the sled do what it does." An unstart will teach humility faster than any colonel. At Mach 3, when an inlet swallows air the wrong way, the airplane shudders as if a god grabbed it by the nose. The pilot's right hand works the throttles like a craftsman sanding. The left hand steadies the beast. The RSO watches a thin line of green numbers and keeps his voice slow on the interphone, because the human voice becomes architecture when metal flirts with chaos. The fix is never a punch. It is a series of small forgivenesses: cone position, throttle finesse, slight bank. That's enough. Don't chase it. Let the air settle. SR-71 crews become connoisseurs of boredom because they understand that boredom is built from 1,000 refusals to be dramatic. That is also why they live. At Kadena, the snake patches multiply on flight jackets. The locals point through chain link at night and learn to count. 1 plume, 2 plumes, a pair of giant cinders in the sky that look like someone has poked holes in the fabric of Okinawa. The airplane leaves, the island returns to insects and boredom, and then hours later, the ground shakes in a minor way, and the airplane is back, heat haloed, as if the night had spat it out. The crew pretends to be ordinary men again. There is always a tech who knows by smell if the jet came home happy. There is always a young airman who tapes the word Habu under a locker mirror because he wants to grow into someone whose life makes nicknames necessary. A man in a Soviet van not far from Severomorsk has his own habits. He resolves not to respect myths, because myths make radar operators late. He convinces himself that the visitor can be handled like any other visitor, if only he ignores the legend in the room. He fails at that because human beings are not blank slates. We carry stories like we carry scars. The first time his scope shows an altitude he would rather not see, his stomach does what all stomachs do. He checks the fusing tables because that is where hope hides. He gives the order that will make his commander proud later. The missile goes. For a sliver of time he allows himself the thought that he has become an adjective, successful. Then the sliver breaks. He writes his report like a steady man and deletes adjectives because they are not welcome in after-action explanations. On a gray morning in England, an SR-71 lands and then leaves again after a coffee and a mechanic's blessing because people in suits in Washington have decided that someone in Moscow needs to be reminded that optics still work. The jet goes transatlantic as if an ocean were a hallway. It sets a record on purpose and then sets another by accident because the airplane is incapable of merely commuting. New York to London in a time that makes dinner reservations awkward. London to Los Angeles in an elapsed that makes jokes about time zones dull. The numbers go on a wall in a museum and stay there because a wall does not get bored. It just waits to be read. The airplane's family is larger than its photographs suggest. Every mission is 3 missions stitched: the sleds, the tankers, the people who listen in rooms with no windows. The jet is a tyrant to fuel planners. Its thirst is not peccadillo, but personality. KC-135Q crews learn to love a refueling schedule that tolerates no flinching. E-3 crews learn to draw pictures for a jet whose own ears are busy doing more subtle work. The cameras in the Blackbird's belly are cold geniuses, wet film savants whose acuity becomes a line in a president's brief the next day. Analysts, the least photogenic heroes in the story, use the photographs to count ships, to note which submarine pens are proud today, to trace a new road on a peninsula that is supposed to have no new roads. If the jet is a blade, the analysts are the hand that makes the cut mean something. An RSO writes a sentence in his personal journal he will never show anyone. The only thing keeping us alive is time. He means the time we buy by getting to the tanker right on the nose, the time we steal from a missile by making it chase an altitude it cannot love, the time a fighter pilot below does not have because he started late and the target does not intend to slow down and wait for him. Time is the operational art that 1,000 pages of tech orders cannot teach. You learn it by feeling how much of it fits in your palms on a good day. Sometimes the airplane becomes patient bait. Over the Sea of Japan, over the Yellow Sea, at the edges of a peninsula where men with medals sleep in caves, the jet flies rectangles drawn so carefully that enemy radars cannot believe the rectangles are not taunts. That is the point. The jets light up. They cycle through modes as they would in war because anger makes honest engineers of us all. The Blackbird listens even when it pretends to be looking elsewhere. Those old spectrum fingerprints become entries in books that travel in locked cases. In some later conflict, somewhere a continent away, when a radar wakes up and hums a certain way, a captain in a trailer will lean forward and say, without drama, "That's our old friend." And some invisible thing will be turned off at exactly the right moment. You cannot put that in a headline. You can only do it until nobody asks how you knew. The airplane retires once because budgets speak louder than missiles. It returns because the world has a way of producing problems that embarrass neat paperwork. Satellites are wonderful until they are not. Clouds laugh at them. Revisit times or calendars when what you want is a clock. Adversaries schedule their sins for the gaps. A manned jet that can be anywhere between breakfast and lunch becomes a hard thing to delete from a toolkit. It retires again, and this time the retirement looks real because museum curators learn to say JP7 without blinking. There is a last flight across a nation where people step out onto porches because television told them to, and the airplane makes them feel the way a comet makes people feel in other centuries, small and lucky. The crew squints through a greenhouse canopy, weeping heat, and writes down speeds that are not stunts, only numbers dormantly present in an airplane's bones. The jet rolls to a stop in a place that smells of school children and fresh paint. The story migrates to plaques. The North would have liked to have an ending to brag about. A MiG-25 ahead at the right angle, a closing velocity you could explain to your wife by drawing lines with a fork on a tablecloth, a missile with the spine for thin air, a Blackbird late or unlucky. It didn't come. They wrote their near misses with courage and sent them up the chain and hoped for sentences that sounded like promotion. The MiG-25 remains an avatar of almost, and in another story, a defector in 1976 will deliver one to the West and let 100 engineers touch the insides of a myth. The West learns that the thing is both brilliant and brittle. The myth changes shape in a day. The SR-71 had performed that same edit of legend for decades without landing. A day in 1987 stands out because it is the opposite of combat. The SR-71 breaks a leg out over the Baltic. The nuance is mechanical, the consequence is mortal if geography is not kind. 4 Swedish JA-37 Viggens climb on a vector that is half professional courtesy, half instinct. They take station near a jet that does not ordinarily need anyone's help. They are neutral in a war grown so stale that neutrality has teeth. If anyone tries to take this kill in peacetime, they will have to do it through Swedes. No one tries. Later, much later, some files lose their locks, and men who kept quiet for a living are thanked with medals longer on history than on ribbon. The photographs of that day show a small, neat choreography in a sky that had no business being kind. A crewman tells a young visitor what the job is not. It's not dodging bullets, he says. It's taking time away from other people's arithmetic. You buy time with fuel and thermostat and discipline. You spend it at the right nanosecond. A SAM sight needs 20 seconds more than it thinks. A fighter sortie needs 4 minutes the pilot does not own. A radar needs constancy in a target that refuses to be constant. The airplane's mythology, untouchable, too fast to catch, is not arrogance, it's a design brief achieved. Over 4,000 tries, nobody turned that brief into a casualty list. In England, a boy watches the jet taxi and thinks it looks alive, not like airplanes he has seen before. It leaks on the ramp like a dog that only remembers its house training on long walks. The boy grows into a man who reads that this leaking is what hot metal does when it will soon be hotter, that the seams close in the sky like hands clasping tightly, that this is not failure, but design. He likes that. He keeps that image when he is older and needs to remember that some problems are not solved. They are only managed into beauty. He reads that the fuel would not catch a match when cold, that the engines needed help to start, that the inlet spikes moved like a second crew. He smiles and says to no one in particular, "Everything worth doing looks like a mess in the beginning." A Soviet colonel at a dacha in the 1990s tells a younger man that the Blackbird was not magic. It was a dare. We could not answer. The younger man says nothing because the younger man grew up on stories that sound better than that. The older man waves a hand. It was too fast. You cannot ask mathematics to confess that slowly they drink. They do not resolve anything. The younger man keeps the sentence anyway, because truth spoken without bitterness is rarer than metals. A final pass. It is not the last or the first. It is only one that reads like a page with all the important lines underlined. Beale is a memory behind them. The tanker is punctual because the tanker is flown by men who got tired of being called support and decided to act like kings. The jet climbs into a sky that keeps not being a color and discovers the familiar company of starlight at noon. The cameras start their slow, clever harvest. The DEF suite does its rude play. Somewhere east, something that looks like a ship wakes a battery that looks like a threat. The 3 letters climb the panel RML, as if 3 stairs. The pilot moves his hand forward with the faith of saints. The J-58s turn fuel into a sermon. The world narrows into a number and an edge. The missile comes like a promise and discovers it is a wish. The tone dies. The crew does not speak for 6 seconds because silence is the offering you give physics when it has spared you in public. The jet goes home the long way to confuse men who chart things. It lands looking pleased with itself because some machines know. A crew chief puts his hand on the chine like a blessing. The debrief is boring on purpose. The words "nothing significant" become, as ever, the holy text of people doing dangerous work correctly. There is a line men like to use at cocktail parties when civilians ask them what the Blackbird felt like. It felt like outrunning a future that hasn't happened yet. It is a silly line and a true one. It means you were always ahead of someone else's plan. And in a world where plans include warheads and funerals and men explaining to children what cities used to be called, that is a kind of mercy. The airplane is a monument to that kind of mercy, black and splayed and arrogant in museums, bored with your staring because it understands that you are not a radar and you cannot hurt it. If the men on the ground had ever caught it, this story would be different, shorter, louder, more tragic. They did not. That is not because they were fools. It is because the air gets thin and guidance gets dumb, and fuses are impatient, and Mach numbers become a polite form of invulnerability. The airplane did as advertised for as long as it had to, and then it retired into glass and quiet. You can derive a moral from that if you need to. Better to simply count. Missiles fired, 0 hits. Record set, record still standing. Photographs taken, wars not started because someone knew where a ship was. Time stolen from men who wanted to waste it. Long lines on maps never crossed in anger because the only people tempted to cross them had enough pictures. Thank you. A man in a Wings and Wrenches t-shirt in a museum leans over to his kid and says the only sentence that matters, "They never hit it." The kid asks why. The man considers trying to say inlets and fusing logic and kinematic envelope to a person still operating with Legos and heroes. He settles for, "It was too fast, too high, and too smart." The kid nods, because kids accept that the world can be saved by obvious things. Later, when the kid is older, he will learn that the obvious thing is not speed, but the refusal to accept that your enemy defines your timeline. He will like that too. There is a damning, quiet elegance to the Blackbird's numbers. You cannot argue with 85,069 feet except by going there yourself and failing to breathe. You cannot argue with Mach 3.2 except by getting there and discovering you have nothing left to do when you arrive. You cannot argue with the transatlantic in under 2 hours because clocks do not lie, and not even committees can make them. These numbers stand in their glass cases like saints' bones, impossible and proven, a finger of fact. They make you smile because they feel like an adult telling you the boogeyman isn't real. In rooms far from runways, men once tried to kill the airplane with memoranda. They succeeded twice and failed once. They blamed money. They blamed redundancy. They praised satellites the way people praise new gods. They were not wrong, but the world is not tidy. It coughs up weather and liars and emergencies and the need to know whether a ship is in one place or another before dinner, not on Thursday. For that kind of world, a machine that treats borders like suggestions and time like prey is awkward to throw away. We threw it away anyway, because nations get to be vain as well as practical. It did not matter. The work had been done. The men who had tried to hit the airplane retired into sweaters. The men who had flown it retired into museums. The sky learned nothing from any of it. It remains cold and thin and decisive. If you want to outrun missiles, the sky will require the same offerings it did in 1968. Heat and nerve, and the kind of engineering that makes accountants breathe into bags. A small final scene, a habit now, not a climax. RAF Mildenhall again, but warmer. The jet is spotted on a far taxi lane, so photographers cannot get easy silhouettes. It lifts on a column of heat like a thing acquainted with hell, angles into a climb that seems unfair to other airplanes, and becomes a line so straight and so sure that some part of your body believes it is a ruler lying across the sky. A van of Soviets somewhere hears their instruments wake and has the communal experience of a workplace meeting that will end with someone winding a string around a fist, RML, in that familiar climb. The throttle's last half-inch, a number on a gauge that means the missile will arrive when the photograph is already on its way home inside a cold camera. A tone that goes to a sulky hum, and then to a hiss, and then to quiet. The pilot shifts in a seat that has molded itself to his bones over years and thinks about fuel. The RSO draws an invisible rectangle in the air with 2 fingers because he is checking the frame in his head against the frame in the camera. They go home. The plane leaks on the ramp. The SEALs will not care until next time. Someone slides a log across a desk and writes words that are always the same and always bear repeating: time on track as fragged, ECM effective, missiles launched, no damage. In some parallel telling, a missile learns humility less slowly. In this telling, the one we get to keep, humility remains with the men who built and flew and failed to shoot down this particular jet. The Blackbird does not gloat. It sits in museums like a border drawn through time. Children place hands against glass. Veterans lean in close as if trying to hear the old roar. Curators polish with a cloth motion that looks like prayer. Above all that, the airplane does what it did best. It refuses to care. It is already gone.